The 52nd floor of Sterling and Hayes Tower gleamed with the kind of cold perfection that only serious money could buy. Daniel Cross stood before the mahogany conference table, his calloused hands steady as he held the marriage contract worth $5 million. The Manhattan skyline stretched behind floor-to-ceiling windows, utterly indifferent to the drama unfolding in this room, where fortunes rose and fell with the stroke of a pen. Across from him, Victoria Sterling crossed her arms, her designer heels clicking against marble as she shifted with visible impatience. The sound echoed in the silence like a countdown timer nobody could see, but everyone could feel. "Sign it." Her voice cut through the tension like a blade finding bone. "For someone like you, this is more than a lifetime's worth." Behind Daniel, 3-year-old Owen tugged at his sleeve, small fingers gripping the worn fabric of his father's jacket. The boy didn't understand the words, but he understood tone perfectly. He understood they were being looked down upon, measured and found wanting by people in expensive suits who smelled like perfume that cost more than his father's monthly rent. Daniel signed without hesitation. His signature flowed across the page in confident strokes, the muscle memory of a man who'd once signed documents that moved millions through corporate channels. Victoria allowed herself a thin smile of victory, already calculating how this acquisition would play with the board, with the Thornton executives, with her mother's impossible expectations. But what Daniel did next made every executive in that room forget how to breathe. He set the pen down gently, then reached into his jacket and produced a single photograph, edges worn soft from years of handling. He placed it beside the contract, sliding it toward Victoria with deliberate care. The image showed a woman with Owen's same honey-colored hair, laughing in a hospital bed while holding a newborn wrapped in pink blankets that had faded to something closer to gray. The woman's face was pale but radiant, filled with joy that transcended the monitors and IV lines surrounding her like mechanical vines. Her name was Emma. Daniel's voice carried despite its softness, filling the space with quiet authority that made Victoria's expensive consultants lean forward unconsciously. "She died 3 years ago when our son was 3 months old. Complications from the accident. Drunk driver ran a red light, T-boned her car on the passenger side. Internal bleeding they couldn't stop. Infections that wouldn't heal no matter what the doctors tried. Her organs failed one by one while I held her hand and promised our son would be okay." He paused, letting the words settle like stones in still water. Owen climbed into his father's lap, small body seeking shelter from the tension crackling through the air like static electricity before a storm. "I'm not signing because I'm desperate, Miss Sterling." Daniel met her eyes with unflinching directness. "I'm signing because my son has tetralogy of Fallot, 4 holes in his heart that no child should have to live with. Without surgery before his 4th birthday, his heart will fail. The operation costs $4.8 million, and I will do whatever it takes to keep him alive." He stood, Owen secure in his arms, the boy's face buried against his father's neck. At the door, Daniel looked back at Victoria, whose perfectly applied makeup couldn't quite hide the pallor beneath. "You bought yourself a husband, Miss Sterling. I hope you got what you paid for." The door closed behind them with a soft click that somehow felt louder than any slam. Victoria stood frozen, staring at the photograph Daniel had left behind. Emma's smile seemed to follow her as she sank into her chair, hands trembling in a way they hadn't since she was 16, and her mother had told her the conditions of her inheritance. She pressed her palms flat against the mahogany surface, willing the shaking to stop, but it persisted like an earthquake too small to measure, but impossible to ignore. The 47 pages of the agreement reduced Daniel to a prop in Victoria's carefully orchestrated life. He was to appear at company functions as her devoted spouse, gazing at her with appropriate admiration whenever cameras were present. He was to smile for photographers, hold her hand at charity galas, and convince a skeptical board of directors that their CEO had finally found stability in her personal life. The merger with Thornton Industries hinged on traditional values that the Thornton patriarch held dear, and Victoria's reputation as a cold, unmarried workaholic had become a serious liability, threatening everything she'd spent a decade building since taking over from her mother. The Thornton family was old money, conservative in their business partnerships, the kind of people who still believed a handshake meant something and a man's word was his bond. They wanted assurance they were joining forces with someone who understood family legacy, someone who was building something that would last beyond quarterly earnings reports and stock price fluctuations. Victoria had calculated that a husband and ready-made child would solve this problem efficiently, like any business challenge requiring creative solutions and strategic thinking. She had not calculated on Daniel Cross being anything more than a simple transaction to be managed and discarded when no longer useful. 2 weeks after the signing, Victoria called Daniel to her corner office for their first official planning session. She didn't look up from her tablet as he entered, scrolling through upcoming events with the focused intensity of a general planning a military campaign. You'll need a new wardrobe. Her fingers swiped across the screen, pulling up images of suits that cost more than Daniel's entire closet. Something that doesn't scream construction worker or whatever it is you do with your hands. Daniel had been a carpenter for 3 years now, ever since leaving his position at a prestigious financial firm downtown. The work was honest and physical, allowing him to be home when Owen woke up from his afternoon nap, to make dinner every evening, to read stories before bed and be present for the small moments that built a childhood. He didn't correct Victoria's dismissive assumption about his background. There would be time for that later, or perhaps there wouldn't. It didn't matter. What mattered was Owen. Only Owen. Always Owen. I'll wear what you provide. His voice stayed even, betraying nothing of the calculus running through his mind. But I choose what my son wears. That's not negotiable. Victoria's eyes flickered up from the tablet, surprise flashing across her features before she could suppress it. The steel beneath his quiet words caught her off guard. Most people sitting across from her either stammered apologies or tried desperately to ingratiate themselves, sensing their futures depended on her goodwill and favor. This man did neither. She studied him for a moment, taking in the worn but clean clothes, the calloused hands resting calmly on the armrests, the way he held himself with a stillness that suggested deep reserves of patience rather than submission. Fine, the word came out sharper than she'd intended. The child is irrelevant to the arrangement anyway. Keep him out of the way, quiet, and we won't have problems. We won't. Daniel felt his jaw tighten with the effort of restraint, but kept his expression neutral. Owen sat in the corner with a coloring book Victoria's assistant had produced, creating a picture of a house with a garden and a dog they'd never owned. The boy was oblivious to the negotiation happening above his head, lost in the simple joy of choosing colors and staying mostly inside the lines. Daniel would shield him from as much of this ugliness as humanly possible. That was the promise he'd made to Emma in those final terrible hours when the machines couldn't keep her heart beating anymore, and it was the promise he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. His name is Owen. Daniel's voice dropped lower, forcing Victoria to lean forward to hear. And he goes where I go or I don't go at all. You want a husband for show? That's what the contract says. But that boy is my son, and he comes with me. Those are my terms. The standoff lasted 5 heartbeats. Victoria's perfectly manicured fingers drummed once against the tablet's glass surface. Then she nodded, sharp and quick, already moving on to the next item on her agenda. Hire a professional nanny for public events. I have someone. Mrs. Chen from our building. Owen trusts her. Victoria waved a hand dismissively, already back to scrolling through her schedule. Daniel took it as the dismissal it was meant to be and stood, collecting Owen and his coloring book. As they walked toward the elevator, Owen's small hand found his father's larger one. Daddy, why the pretty lady always look mad? Daniel pressed the elevator button, watching the numbers light up as the car ascended toward them. How did you explain to a 3-year-old that some people built walls so high they forgot what it felt like to live without them? She's not mad, sweetheart. Just busy. Lots of responsibility. Lots of people depending on her. She talks mean to you. The elevator dinged open. Daniel guided Owen inside, pressing the button for the ground floor. Through the glass walls, Manhattan spread out below them like a circuit board of lights and steel. Some people don't know how to talk any other way. He knelt down, brushing a strand of honey-colored hair from Owen's forehead. Doesn't mean they're bad, just scared. Owen considered this with the gravity of a philosopher twice his age. What's she scared of? Daniel thought about Victoria's immaculate office, her controlled expressions, the way she'd flinched when he'd mentioned keeping Owen close. What was anyone scared of, really, when you stripped away all the money and power and carefully constructed defenses. Maybe what we're all scared of, bud. Being alone, not being enough, not being loved for who we really are underneath all the armor we wear. The elevator reached the ground floor. Daniel took Owen's hand and they stepped out into the lobby, leaving the tower behind. But Victoria's question followed them all the way home to Brooklyn, bouncing around in Daniel's head like a marble in an empty jar. What was she really afraid of? And why, against all reason and self-preservation, did he want to know? That night, after Owen was asleep, Daniel stood at the window of their fourth-floor walk-up, looking out at the Brooklyn street below. Neighbors sat on stoops, kids played stickball under the streetlights. Mrs. Chen watered the plants on her fire escape 3 windows over. This was home. This was real. Victoria Sterling's world of marble floors and designer suits and $5 million contracts felt like a fever dream, something that would vanish when he finally woke up. But Owen's medical bills were real. The cardiologist's warnings were real. The surgery that could save his son's life was real, and it required money Daniel didn't have and couldn't earn through honest carpentry work, no matter how many custom cabinets he built or how many hours he logged in the workshop. So he would play Victoria Sterling's game. He would be the dutiful husband, the presentable accessory, the solution to her merger problem. He would smile for cameras and hold her hand at galas and pretend they were something they weren't. And when the year was done and Owen was safe and healthy, Daniel would take his son and disappear back into the life they'd built together. Just the two of them against the world. That was the plan. Clean, simple, transactional. He didn't account for the way Victoria's mask would slip in unguarded moments. Didn't account for the intelligence behind those cold eyes, or the loneliness he'd glimpsed when she thought no one was watching. Didn't account for the possibility that buying a husband might be the first honest thing Victoria Sterling had done in years, even if the honesty was wrapped in lies. The weeks that followed established a pattern of quiet tension that neither of them fully understood. Victoria would issue commands with the expectation of immediate compliance, and Daniel would comply with a calm that seemed to irritate her far more than any argument it would have. She told him where to stand at events, precisely 3 inches behind her left shoulder, unless photographs required otherwise. She told him how to speak to journalists, which topics to avoid, which carefully crafted anecdotes to share as if they were genuine memories instead of manufactured talking points her PR team had focus tested. She told him when to smile and when to remain stoic, when to touch her arm affectionately and when to maintain professional distance. She corrected his posture with sharp words, criticized his attempts at small talk with industry executives, and reminded him constantly of the financial gulf between them, as if he might somehow forget his place in this arrangement. Each instruction was delivered with the precision of a general directing troops, and each response from Daniel came with a patience that baffled her completely. At the Metropolitan Museum Gala, Victoria's fingernails dug into his arm when he reached for a champagne flute. "You're holding it wrong." Her smile stayed frozen for the photographers circling them like sharks scenting blood. "Stem, not bowl. How many times must I explain basic etiquette?" Daniel adjusted his grip without comment, his eyes scanning the crowd with the relaxed attentiveness of someone who'd attended 1,000 similar events in another life. The muscle memory was still there, buried under 3 years of sawdust and honest labor, but present nonetheless. Better. Victoria's concession came reluctantly, as if the word cost her something to speak. "Now look at me like you actually want to be here. Like I'm the most interesting person in this room filled with people far more accomplished than either of us will ever be." He met her eyes, and something in his gaze made her falter mid-instruction. There was no resentment there, no wounded pride waiting to strike back, no simmering anger building toward an explosive confrontation. Just steady patience she couldn't quite categorize, couldn't file away in any mental box she'd constructed for dealing with difficult people. It unnerved her in ways she refused to examine too closely. She was accustomed to people who either cowered before her authority or fought back with equal aggression, giving her something to push against, something to defeat and dominate. Daniel did neither. He simply existed beside her, solid and unshakable, like a tree that had learned to bend with wind without breaking, like a mountain that let storms rage around it without moving an inch. And somehow, impossibly, he made her feel like the one who was off balance. Late at night, long after the events ended and the champagne wore off, Daniel returned to their small apartment in the modest Brooklyn neighborhood Victoria had never visited and probably couldn't locate without GPS assistance. The building was pre-war construction, its creaky stairs announcing every arrival and departure, radiators clanking in winter like percussion instruments played by ghosts. But neighbors looked out for each other here. Mr. Kowalski on the second floor fixed things when they broke. Mrs. Chen watched Owen when Daniel had to work late. The superintendent actually responded when you called about problems instead of letting them fester until they became emergencies. Daniel made dinner for Owen every evening without fail, a sacred ritual that grounded them both. Tonight it was spaghetti with marinara sauce from scratch, garlic bread, and green beans that Owen would inevitably push around his plate, but ultimately eat because his father asked nicely and explained why growing bodies needed vegetables. They sat at the small kitchen table meant for two, but somehow always big enough for their needs. Owen chattered about his day at Mrs. Chen's apartment, about the cartoon he'd watched, about the puzzle he'd almost finished before nap time interrupted his progress. Daniel listened with complete attention, as if nothing else in the world existed beyond this table and this moment in this child who'd lost his mother too young. He asked questions, laughed at jokes that didn't quite make sense yet, but would someday, treated Owen's thoughts as worthy of genuine engagement, rather than the dismissive patience adults too often showed children. After dinner came bath time, then stories, then the careful ritual of checking Owen's oxygen levels and administering the medications that kept his damaged heart functioning well enough to get through another day. Daniel had memorized the schedule, the dosages, the warning signs that meant they needed to call the cardiologist immediately rather than waiting for the next scheduled appointment. Owen's small hand found his father's face as Daniel tucked him in, the boy's fingers tracing familiar features in the dim light from the hallway. "Daddy, why does the pretty lady always look mad?" They'd been over this before, but repetition was how children process the world. So Daniel answered again with fresh patience. "She's not mad, sweetheart. Just busy. Important job. Lots of people counting on her to make good decisions. She talks mean to you." Owen's voice carried the certainty of a 3-year-old who understood more than adults gave him credit for. "Some people don't know how to talk any other way." Daniel smoothed the blanket over his son's small chest, feeling the irregular heartbeat beneath. "Doesn't mean they're bad inside, just scared of showing who they really are." What's she scared of? Daniel thought about Victoria's penthouse that he'd never seen but could imagine. All glass and steel and expensive art that meant nothing to anyone. He thought about the way her hands had trembled when he'd placed Emma's photograph on that mahogany table, the way she'd looked at Owen like he was a puzzle she couldn't solve using any algorithm in her impressive mental arsenal. Maybe she's scared of the same things we are. Being alone in the dark, not mattering to anyone, not being loved just for being herself without all the titles and money and power that usually come with her name. Owen's eyes were already drifting closed, the medication doing its work. "We're not alone, we have each other." "That's right, buddy. We have each other." Daniel stayed until Owen's breathing evened out into the shallow rhythm of sleep, then carefully checked the pulse oximeter one more time before allowing himself to leave the room. He stood in the doorway watching his son's small form under the covers and felt the familiar tightness in his chest that had nothing to do with his own heart and everything to do with the fragile life entrusted to his care. Emma's photograph watched him from the bookshelf, forever young, forever smiling, forever frozen in that moment before everything went wrong. Some nights he talked to her, updating her on Owen's progress, asking for guidance he knew wouldn't come. Tonight he was too tired for even that small comfort. Tomorrow there was a corporate dinner with the Thornton executives. Victoria had sent him a briefing document 30 pages long, detailing every person who would be there, their positions, their interests, the topics he should discuss, and the ones he should avoid like landmines. She'd included a new suit, tailored to fit him perfectly despite never taking his measurements, because apparently she guessed his size just by looking. The efficiency should have impressed him. Instead, it made him sad in ways he couldn't quite articulate. The dinner at Le Bernardin went smoother than Victoria had dared hope. Daniel wore the charcoal suit she'd selected, and despite her expectations of awkwardness, he moved through the room with surprising ease. When Harold Thornton asked what he did for work, Victoria tensed, ready to intervene with one of the prepared cover stories her team had developed. Daniel's answer came before she could speak. I build furniture, custom pieces, mostly. Cabinets, tables, things meant to last longer than the people who commission them. Harold Thornton, 72 years old and worth $300 million, set down his wine glass with interest rather than disdain. Honest work. I respect that deeply. Too many people today want wealth without labor, success without sacrifice. They've forgotten that everything of value requires someone to actually make it with their own two hands. Daniel nodded, meeting the older man's eyes with quiet confidence. My father taught me that the character of a man shows in what he builds that will outlast him. Wise man, your father. Thornton leaned back, studying Daniel with renewed attention. What's the most challenging piece you've ever made? A crib. Daniel's voice stayed steady, but something shifted in his expression. For my son, his mother died when he was 3 months old. I wanted him to have something from me that would keep him safe while he slept. Something he could pass down to his own children someday if he's fortunate enough to have them. The table went quiet. Margaret Thornton, Harold's wife of 50 years, pressed her hand to her heart. You're a widower, raising a child alone? Yes, ma'am, 3 years now. How old is your boy? 3, his name is Owen. Victoria watched this exchange with growing unease. This wasn't in the script. Daniel was supposed to deflect personal questions, redirect to safe topics, maintain the carefully constructed narrative her team had built. Instead, he was offering genuine pieces of his life to these strangers, turning the evening into something real when it was supposed to remain performance. Margaret pulled out her phone. May I see a picture? Daniel didn't hesitate. His phone emerged from his pocket, screen already displaying a photo of Owen laughing in a park, honey-colored hair catching sunlight, small hands covered in ice cream. This was last week. He'd just figured out how to pump his legs on the swing by himself. Small victory, but they all count when you're 3. He's beautiful. Margaret's voice went soft with grandmotherly affection. He has your eyes, but someone else's hair. His mother's. She had hair that color, like honey in summer light. Victoria felt something uncomfortable twist in her chest. Jealousy? Impossible. She wasn't jealous of a dead woman, wasn't envious of the obvious love in Daniel's voice when he spoke about his late wife. That would be absurd, beneath her, emotionally immature in ways she'd trained herself out of years ago. Yet the feeling persisted, sharp and unwelcome. The conversation flowed on. Daniel proved remarkably adept at reading the room, knowing when to speak and when to listen, asking thoughtful questions that made the Thorntons light up with pleasure. He discussed woodworking techniques with Harold, who revealed a long-buried interest in carpentry from his youth. He talked about Owen's favorite books with Margaret, who'd been a children's librarian before her marriage. By the time dessert arrived, Victoria realized with dawning surprise that the Thorntons liked Daniel. Actually liked him, not the polite tolerance she'd anticipated, but genuine warmth. Harold was already inviting them to the family estate in Connecticut, and Margaret was planning play dates between Owen and her various grandchildren. The merger was saved. Victoria should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt strangely hollow, watching Daniel charm people with nothing but honesty, while she'd spent years perfecting calculated artifice. 3 weeks into the arrangement, Victoria's mother arrived unannounced at the Sterling and Hayes offices. Evelyn Sterling didn't make social calls. She made inspections, delivered verdicts, assessed whether her carefully laid plans were unfolding according to design. The Thorntons called me. Evelyn settled into Victoria's chair with the ease of someone who'd occupied it for 30 years before passing it down. They're impressed with your husband. Harold thinks he's the most genuine person you have ever dated, and Margaret wants to adopt him into the family immediately. Victoria remained standing, arms crossed defensively. That's good. It means the strategy is working. Is it strategy? Evelyn's perfectly arched eyebrow rose slightly. Harold mentioned Daniel as a widower, single father, builds furniture with his hands. You didn't mention any of that in your briefing. It wasn't relevant to the arrangement, wasn't it? Evelyn stood, moving to the window overlooking Manhattan. I set you a test, Victoria. Build a family. Show me you understand what I never did. That success without connection is just loneliness in a corner office. I expected you to fake it. Contract for a husband. Manufacture a relationship. Check the boxes while your heart stayed locked behind walls you've spent your entire life constructing. Victoria said nothing. Her mother continued, voice carrying decades of hard-won wisdom. But something tells me this isn't playing out the way either of us expected. The Thorntons don't rave about people who are performing. They've seen enough corporate theater throw-in to recognize authenticity when it appears. What do you want me to say, Mother? Evelyn turned from the window, and for just a moment, her expression softened into something almost resembling maternal concern. I want you to be honest with yourself about what this arrangement really is. About whether you contracted for a husband or found something you didn't know you were looking for. She left without waiting for a response, her heels clicking against marble in a rhythm Victoria had been hearing her entire life. The sound always meant judgment was being passed, assessments were being made, and someone would be found wanting. Victoria sank into her chair, staring at the doorway her mother had just exited through. Honest with herself. What a concept. Honesty required vulnerability, and vulnerability was the one luxury she couldn't afford. Not when the company's future hung in the balance. Not when her inheritance depended on passing her mother's impossible test. Not when a 3-year-old boy with a damaged heart was depending on her to maintain this fiction long enough for his father to save his life. The press conference was Victoria's idea of a soft launch for their public relationship, carefully choreographed to maximize positive coverage while minimizing opportunities for difficult questions. She'd orchestrated every detail with military precision, camera placement to capture her best angles, the exact shade of Daniel's tie matching her accessories, a pre-screened list of journalists allowed to attend, even the temperature of the room adjusted to prevent anyone from appearing to sweat under pressure. Reporters crowded the media room as Victoria introduced Daniel as her husband of 6 months, the lie rolling off her tongue with practiced ease. They'd eloped quietly, she explained, wanting privacy until now. A Caribbean beach wedding, intimate and perfect. The fabricated story was supported by fabricated documentation her legal team had produced with impressive attention to detail. Daniel stood beside her in the navy suit she'd chosen, expression appropriately devoted, playing his role exactly as scripted. He'd studied the briefing materials, memorized the cover story, practiced answering likely questions until the responses sounded natural rather than rehearsed. Owen waited backstage with Mrs. Chen under strict instructions to stay out of sight until called for the planned family photograph that would close the event. The questions began predictably. How did they meet? Through mutual friends at a charity function? What attracted her to him, his genuine nature and devotion to family? What were their plans? Growing together, supporting each other's work, raising Owen in a loving home. All lies, all carefully constructed, all working perfectly. Before the question and answer session could conclude, Victoria reached to adjust Daniel's tie, a small gesture meant to look affectionate for the cameras. The kind of casual touch that spoke of familiarity between spouses, of comfortable intimacy earned through shared mornings and bedtimes, and all the small moments that built a life together. Her fingers were clinical, adjusting his appearance like she was positioning a mannequin for a window display. Daniel caught her wrist gently, so gently the cameras didn't capture the moment. So gently it could have been affection rather than correction. He leaned close, lips near her ear, voice pitched low enough that the microphones wouldn't pick it up. I understand the performance, but not in front of my son. He's watching through that door over there. He sees more than you think, learning lessons about love I never intended to teach him. Victoria's hand stilled as the words registered. She glanced toward the side entrance where Owen's small face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and attentive, missing absolutely nothing. The boy's expression was grave, too serious for a 3-year-old, processing adult dynamics with a perceptiveness that came from losing a parent too young. Something twisted in Victoria's chest, uncomfortable and unfamiliar. Almost like shame, though she'd trained herself out of that emotion years ago when it proved useless in the corporate world. She pulled back, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she had no cutting remark ready, no sharp response to maintain her armor of superiority. A reporter raised her hand. Can we hear from Mr. Cross? Get the husband's perspective on this whirlwind romance. Victoria tensed, her hand finding Daniel's arm in a grip meant to look supportive, but felt like a warning. Stay on script. Don't improvise. Remember what we practiced. Daniel stepped forward with an ease that surprised her, the confidence of someone who'd addressed skeptical rooms before, who understood how to read an audience and give them what they needed to hear. Meeting Victoria was unexpected. His voice carried clearly without strain. I was drawn to her dedication and fierce intelligence. She doesn't do anything halfway, doesn't accept mediocrity from herself or anyone around her. Those qualities can seem intimidating from the outside, but they come from a deep commitment to excellence that I find inspiring. The lies came smoothly, wrapped in enough truth to be convincing. Victoria was dedicated, undeniably true. She was intelligent. No one could argue otherwise. Those facts were real enough to anchor the fiction around them. A crash backstage interrupted the carefully orchestrated flow. Mrs. Chen's startled exclamation, followed by a small, running footsteps. The door burst open and Owen appeared, having escaped his minder, small legs carrying him across the stage with toddler determination. "Daddy! Daddy!" Daniel scooped him up seamlessly, incorporating the interruption into the narrative without missing a beat. Owen settled against his father's shoulder, thumb finding his mouth in the way it did when he felt overwhelmed or scared. The room full of strangers with cameras and microphones was too much, too big, too bright. "This is the real boss of our family." Daniel's voice filled with genuine warmth that no amount of coaching could have produced. "He keeps us both in line, makes sure we remember what actually matters in life." Laughter rippled through the journalists, charmed by the unscripted moment. Owen peeked out from his father's neck, studying the crowd with cautious, three-year-old suspicion. Then his gaze found Victoria, standing apart from them, and his expression shifted. "Pretty," he announced clearly, loud enough for every microphone to catch. A pause while he processed his own thoughts, then added with devastating, three-year-old honesty, "Daddy talks about the pretty lady at night when he thinks I'm sleeping." The room erupted in delighted murmurs. Perfect material, better than any publicist could have scripted. Daniel's face flushed with genuine embarrassment, the kind of authentic reaction that couldn't be faked. Victoria froze, completely unprepared for this deviation from the plan. Did he talk about her when he thought Owen was asleep? Why did that knowledge make her feel something other than professional satisfaction that their arrangement was functioning properly? The press conference concluded in a blur of camera flashes and follow-up questions. Victoria answered automatically, her media training carrying her through while her mind replayed Owen's innocent revelation. "Daddy talks about the pretty lady at night." What did Daniel say in those private moments? Did he complain about her demands and corrections? Did he laugh at her desperate need for control? Did he pity her obvious loneliness? Backstage, Victoria found herself watching Daniel with Owen. The boy had buried his face in his father's shoulder again, overwhelmed by the attention and noise. Daniel swayed slightly, the unconscious motion of a parent soothing a distressed child, humming something too soft for Victoria to hear, but clearly effective. Owen's small body gradually relaxed, tension bleeding out as his father's steady presence reassured him that everything was okay. Mrs. Chen appeared, apologetic and flustered. Daniel waved off her apologies with easy grace, told her these things happen, thanked her for watching Owen so he could do this appearance that neither of them wanted, but both understood was necessary. The kindness in his voice made Victoria's chest ache in ways she didn't have vocabulary to describe. That night, alone in her penthouse that suddenly felt too large and too empty, Victoria searched for footage of the press conference online. The clip had already gone viral. Owen's pretty lady comment was trending across social media, people cooing over the adorable family, the genuine love obvious between father and son, the CEO who'd found her heart. If only they knew the truth. Victoria paused the video on a frame showing Daniel looking at her. Something in his expression caught her attention, held it. His eyes showed, what? Not contempt, not calculation. Something else entirely. Something she couldn't name because she'd never seen it directed at her before. She replayed the moment, studied his face, tried to decode what she was seeing. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. The Thornton deal was proceeding ahead of schedule. Harold had called personally to express his approval of Daniel, his happiness that Victoria had found such a grounded partner. The merger was all but guaranteed now. Victoria should have felt triumphant. Instead, she felt hollow, watching Daniel's face on her screen, trying to understand why a man she was paying to pretend looked at her with something that almost resembled genuine care. She called her head of security. I need a complete background check on Daniel Cross. Everything, not the surface level report we did before the contract. I want to know who he really is, what he's really done, where he came from before the carpentry. Every detail, no matter how small. If Daniel Cross was playing a deeper game, she needed to know. If he was genuinely who he appeared to be, a good father doing whatever necessary to save his son, she needed to understand that too. Because Victoria Sterling hadn't built a successful company by accepting things at face value. She investigated, she verified, she protected herself from threats before they could materialize. And Daniel Cross, with his quiet dignity and his 3-year-old son, and his patience that never cracked no matter how sharply she spoke, was starting to feel like a threat to walls she'd spent 34 years constructing brick by careful brick. The report arrived 1 week later. Victoria sat at her desk at midnight, the office empty except for security personnel floors below. The manila folder was thick, comprehensive, exactly what she'd demanded. She opened it with hands that wanted to tremble but didn't, because Victoria Sterling didn't allow herself to show weakness even when alone. Page 1 confirmed what her previous background check had shown. 3 years as a carpenter in Brooklyn, specializing in custom furniture. Solid reputation for quality work. Single father, widower, no criminal record, no debts beyond medical bills that would bury most people. Page 2 was where things got interesting. Before the carpentry came a gap, 7 years that her initial background check had missed because the databases didn't connect properly, because Daniel had changed employers and cities, because the records existed but required deep digging to assemble into coherent narrative. Page 3 made her breath catch. Hartwell and Partners, senior financial analyst, 6 years of employment, rapid advancement, consistently excellent performance reviews, youngest person ever on track for partner at age 32. Page 4 detailed a specific deal, the Hartwell-Meridian merger. Daniel Cross had been the lead analyst, the architect of a strategy that saved both companies from bankruptcy, preserved 14,000 jobs, created value that financial journals still cited as textbook execution. His work was taught at Wharton, at Harvard Business School, at every MBA program worth its tuition costs. Victoria kept reading. The story unfolded across 20 pages of documentation, each detail adding depth to a picture she'd never imagined. Daniel hadn't failed at Hartwell. He'd walked away at the peak of success because his wife got sick and needed him more than the partnership track needed another ambitious analyst. He'd taken leave when Emma was in the hospital, extended it when she came home with medical equipment that turned their apartment into a makeshift ICU, extended it again when she died and Owen needed a parent who was actually present rather than chasing deals across time zones. By the time Daniel had surfaced from grief, his clients had been reassigned, his accounts distributed, his place in the firm filled by someone who'd been there when decisions needed making. No scandal, no failure, just a man who chose his family over his career and paid the professional price without complaint or bitterness. Victoria closed the folder, staring at the Manhattan skyline outside her windows. She'd called Daniel a construction worker with dismissive certainty. She'd treated him as if he were intellectually beneath her, as if his current circumstances defined his capabilities and his worth. She'd been so catastrophically wrong. More than that, she realized with creeping horror, she'd revealed exactly who she was in those moments of casual cruelty. She'd shown Daniel Cross that she was the kind of person who measured human value by current economic status, who looked at a carpenter and saw only someone less than, rather than someone who'd sacrificed everything for love. He knew what she was. He'd known from the first conversation, the first cutting remark, the first dismissive gesture, and he'd accepted her money anyway, signing the contract that made him complicit in her deception, because his son's life was worth enduring her contempt for 12 months. Victoria had purchased many things in her 34 years. This was the first time she'd bought someone's dignity, and the weight of that transaction settled on her shoulders like a physical burden she couldn't shrug off no matter how she tried. She reached for her phone, then stopped. What would she say? I'm sorry for treating you as if you were nothing. I'm sorry I didn't recognize your sacrifice as strength rather than weakness. I'm sorry I've never met anyone who gave up everything for love and can't process what that means about the choices I've made in my own life. The words wouldn't come. Victoria Sterling built empires with words, negotiated billion-dollar deals with precision language, but couldn't find the vocabulary to apologize to a man she'd hired to pretend to love her. Instead, she opened her laptop and pulled up Sterling and Hayes's organizational chart. Somewhere in the company's structure, there had to be a place for someone with Daniel's skills. Not charity. He'd reject that instantly and rightfully. But genuine work that matched his capabilities, that gave him opportunities beyond sawdust and stubborn wood grain. She worked through the night, building a proposal that would survive his inevitable suspicion, that would feel like recognition rather than pity. When dawn broke over Manhattan, Victoria had a plan. Whether she had the courage to present it was another question entirely. But Daniel Cross deserved better than being treated as a prop in someone else's performance. And maybe, just maybe, if Victoria could acknowledge that truth, she could begin building something real from the transactional foundation they'd started with. Outside her windows, the city woke up. Somewhere in Brooklyn, Daniel was making breakfast for Owen, helping a 3-year-old brush his teeth, checking medication dosages, being present for all the small moments that built a childhood. He was doing honest work that mattered more than quarterly earnings or stock prices or mergers with companies that had forgotten what family actually meant. And Victoria Sterling, sitting alone in her corner office with a background report that had shattered her comfortable assumptions, finally understood what her mother had been trying to teach her all along. The board meeting convened on a Thursday morning when winter rain hammered against the windows of Sterling and Hayes's executive conference room. Victoria had prepared meticulously for this quarterly progress report, her presentation polished to razor sharpness, every potential question anticipated and countered before it could be asked. The Thornton merger was proceeding ahead of schedule, and she intended to cement her position with a display of competence that would silence even her harshest critics. Richard Blackwood sat 3 seats down from the head of the table, his silver hair impeccably groomed, his Brioni suit speaking of old money and older attitudes. He'd opposed Victoria's leadership from the moment Evelyn Sterling had announced her daughter as successor, believing with bone-deep certainty that women lacked the necessary ruthlessness for corporate warfare. That Victoria had proven more ruthless than most men only made him hate her more intensely. Daniel occupied a chair near the back. Owen settled on his lap with a coloring book Mrs. Chen had provided. The boy was supposed to wait in the adjoining lounge, but he'd been clingy this morning, his lips showing the faint blue tinge that meant his heart was struggling more than usual. Daniel had made the calculation in seconds: bring Owen where he could monitor him, or risk a medical crisis while separated. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. Victoria delivered her opening remarks with the precision of a surgeon making an incision. Revenue projections exceeded targets by 7%. The Thornton family had expressed enthusiasm for the merger timeline. Market analysts were upgrading their recommendations based on Sterling and Hayes's strategic positioning. Everything was proceeding according to plan, better than plan, a testament to her leadership during challenging economic conditions. Blackwood waited until she finished, let the brief applause die down, then leaned forward with the expression of a cat who'd cornered something small and helpless. I'd like to hear from Mr. Cross. His voice carried false civility, poison wrapped in politeness. After all, he's become quite the topic of discussion around the building. Our CEO's little project, so to speak. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 5 degrees. Daniel remained still, one hand resting protectively on Owen's back, as the boy concentrated on coloring a picture of a fire truck. Blackwood continued, warming to his theme, enjoying the discomfort spreading through the assembled executives like spilled wine across white linen. A renovation project, really. Blue collar to boardroom. Quite the transformation you are attempting, Victoria. Very charitable of you, very modern and progressive. Shows real commitment to diversity initiatives. He turned his full attention to Daniel, contempt leaking through his professional veneer like water through cracked concrete. Tell me, Mr. Cross, how does it feel to be the company's charity case? To know that everyone in this room sees exactly what you are, a working-class nobody in an expensive suit, No matter how thoroughly Victoria tries to polish the rough edges, silence crashed down like a wave. Owen looked up from his coloring book, small face confused by the harsh tone, by the sudden tension that made all the adults go rigid in their chairs. The boy didn't understand the specific words, but he understood meanness when he heard it, recognized cruelty by the way it made his stomach hurt and his chest feel tight. Daniel's jaw clenched, the only visible sign that Blackwood's words had landed. His hands tightened on the armrests, knuckles going white with the effort of restraint. He'd endured worse than this. Emma dying by inches in a hospital bed, holding Owen while the cardiologist explained his son might not live to see kindergarten. The slow grind of poverty that came with choosing love over ambition. Rich men throwing insults were nothing compared to real suffering. But Owen saw it. Owen heard it. Owen processed that his father was being attacked, diminished, treated as less than human by someone who thought money made him better. The boy's face crumpled like paper crushed in an angry fist. Tears came first, silent and desperate. The kind children cried when trying to be brave for their parents. Owen pressed small hands over his ears as if he could block out words already finding their target, already burrowing deep into a 3-year-old's developing understanding of how the world worked and where his father fit in its cruel hierarchies. Then came the sounds, small and hiccuping, devastating in their helplessness. The sound of a child whose world had just become less safe. "Daddy! Daddy!" Daniel was moving before anyone else could react, instinct and love overriding every other consideration. 3 strides carried him to Owen, and he gathered the boy into his arms with fierce protectiveness. Owen buried his face in his father's shoulder, small body shaking with sobs that came from somewhere deeper than temporary upset. "Shh, buddy. It's okay. I've got you." Daniel's voice stayed steady despite the storm in his eyes, the rage he was containing because his son needed calm right now, needed reassurance that the foundation of his world remained solid even when cruel men tried to shake it. He stood, Owen clinging to him like the only fixed point in a universe gone liquid, and faced the room with dignity that made every executive present feel shame they hadn't earned the right to experience. "I apologize for the interruption." Each word was placed with deliberate care, like stones building a wall that would outlast everything in this temporary room. "We'll excuse ourselves now." He walked toward the door without hurrying, maintaining composure even as Owen's sobs continued against his neck. At Blackwood's chair, Daniel paused, looking down at the man who'd deliberately hurt his child to score points in a power struggle that had nothing to do with a 3-year-old's well-being. "I may be poor in money, Mr. Blackwood." The words came quiet but devastating, each syllable a nail driven home. "But my son will never see his father treated as less than human, and he will never learn cruelty from men like you. That's something your wealth can't buy, your connections can't provide, and your position can't grant you access to." The door clicked shut behind them, somehow louder than any slam, somehow more final than any dramatic exit. The silence they left behind felt thick enough to choke on, heavy with collective guilt and secondhand shame. Victoria sat frozen, every pair of eyes turning toward her, waiting to see how she'd respond to this public disruption of her carefully orchestrated meeting. She should smooth things over, redirect to the agenda, demonstrate control over situations that threatened to spiral into chaos. That's what CEOs did. They managed crises, contained damage, maintained order when disorder threatened. Instead, she replayed Daniel carrying his crying son, fierce protectiveness in every line of his body, dignity maintained even in retreat. She'd brought him into this world of sharks and watched them draw blood from an innocent child who'd done nothing except exist in a space where he wasn't wanted. "We're done for today." Her voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw by emotions she didn't have names for. "Reconvene next quarter." She gathered her presentation materials with hands that wanted to shake but didn't, walked to her office on legs that felt disconnected from conscious control, and locked the door behind her. The Manhattan skyline stretched outside her windows, indifferent to human suffering, uncaring about the small tragedies that played out in conference rooms, where money and power crushed anything softer than themselves. Victoria sank into her chair and let her head fall into her hands. The image of Owen's face crumpling, of his small hands pressed over his ears, of his father's quiet fury contained because a child needed comfort more than his father needed revenge. It played on repeat behind her closed eyes, like footage she couldn't stop watching. What had she become? When had she turned into someone who would subject a 3-year-old to Blackwood's cruelty just to maintain a fiction that was eating her alive from the inside? Her phone buzzed with texts from board members expressing concern, from PR advisors offering damage control strategies, from her mother requesting an immediate call. Victoria ignored them all. For the first time in her career, she simply sat in the wreckage of her choices and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd done. 3 days passed before Victoria gathered enough courage to visit Daniel's neighborhood. 3 days of sleepless nights and distracted meetings in an unfamiliar feeling that eventually crystallized into something she could identify. Guilt, sharp and persistent, refusing to be rationalized away or compartmentalized into boxes where uncomfortable emotions usually went to die. She had his address from the contract paperwork, coordinates she'd noted with dismissive certainty that she'd never need to visit his world, never need to see how normal people lived when they weren't performing for cameras or board members. But standing on a Brooklyn sidewalk as evening light faded to purple dusk, looking up at the pre-war building where laundry hung from fire escapes and children's bikes cluttered the entryway, Victoria felt more out of place than she'd ever felt anywhere. The neighborhood thrummed with life that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or market positioning. Corner bodegas advertised lottery tickets and cheap beer. Families gathered on stoops, speaking Spanish and Cantonese, and languages Victoria couldn't identify. A basketball bounced somewhere nearby, accompanied by trash talk and laughter. This was community, the kind built on proximity and shared struggle, rather than strategic networking and mutual benefit calculations. Victoria climbed 4 flights of stairs that announced her presence with creaks and groans, each step requiring more determination than the last. Outside Daniel's door, she stood for a full minute rehearsing words that still felt inadequate, preparing apologies that couldn't undo the damage Blackwood had inflicted with her implicit permission. Daniel answered with Owen balanced on his hip, clearly in the middle of making dinner, based on the tomato sauce staining his apron and the garlic smell wafting from the apartment behind him. He looked surprised to see her, then guarded, then simply tired. The bone-deep exhaustion of someone who'd spent 3 days explaining to a 3-year-old why some people were mean and whether his daddy was actually less important than other daddies. "Ms. Sterling, is there a work emergency that couldn't wait until business hours?" "I came to apologize." Victoria forced the words out before pride could reassert itself. "For what Blackwood said, for not stopping him sooner, for putting you and Owen in that position where he could hurt you both, because I needed to maintain appearances for people who don't deserve the effort." Daniel studied her for a long moment, weighing something she couldn't see, measuring sincerity against self-interest and calculations he'd probably been running since the contract signing. Then he stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Would you like to come in?" The apartment was small by any objective measure, maybe 700 square feet total, but warm in ways Victoria's penthouse never achieved despite architectural awards and interior designer credentials. Furniture didn't match but somehow worked together. A couch from one era, a coffee table from another, assembled over time rather than purchased in a single expensive shopping trip. Owen's medical equipment occupied one corner. Like permanent house guests, nobody could ask to leave. Children's drawings covered the refrigerator in explosions of crayon color and questionable anatomy. A handmade bookshelf held worn paperbacks and board books with corners softened by repeated reading. This was a home. Everything Victoria's penthouse wasn't. Everything she'd convinced herself she didn't need because needing meant weakness, and weakness meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant pain. Owen regarded her with wariness that hadn't been present before the board meeting, the natural suspicion of a child who'd learned that the pretty lady's world contained people who hurt his daddy. He stayed close to Daniel's leg, thumb finding his mouth in the self-soothing gesture that meant he felt uncertain about what came next. Victoria knelt down to his level, her Valentino dress be damned, her carefully maintained professional distance be damned. Everything that had seemed important 3 days ago suddenly revealed as the shallow posturing it had always been. "Hi, Owen. I'm Victoria. I'm sorry if I scared you at the office." That man who said mean things, he doesn't speak for me, and he won't be around you again. Owen studied her with 3-year-old solemnity, processing this information against his limited, but growing understanding of how adult promises worked and whether they could be trusted. You pretty. His voice came out small, tentative, like Daddy says. Daniel made a sound that might have been embarrassment or resignation. Victoria's throat tightened with emotions she couldn't name. Owen continued, warming to his theme now that he'd decided she wasn't an immediate threat. Daddy says you got sad eyes behind the mad ones. When had anyone seen her that clearly? When had anyone looked past the armor she wore like a second skin and recognized the loneliness underneath? Victoria blinked rapidly, refusing to let tears form, refusing to show weakness in front of a 3-year-old who'd already seen too much of adult failure. Maybe your daddy sees things other people miss. Daniel cleared his throat. Would you like to stay for dinner? It's just spaghetti, nothing fancy or complicated, but there's plenty. Victoria should decline. She should maintain boundaries, keep their relationship professional, avoid blurring lines that were already smudged beyond recognition. Instead, she heard herself accepting, following Daniel into the kitchen, watching him cook with the same quiet competence he brought to everything else. They sat at a table meant for 2, stretched to accommodate 3. Owen's booster seat put him at eye level with the adults, giving him equal status in the conversation rather than relegating him to child territory. The pasta was better than anything Victoria's private chef had ever prepared, rich with flavor that came from care rather than expensive ingredients. Daniel asked Owen about his day, about the puzzle he'd worked on with Mrs. Chen, about the cartoon where the boy solved mysteries. He listened with complete attention, laughing at appropriate moments, treating his son's thoughts as worthy of genuine engagement rather than patronizing dismissal. Victoria watched this interaction like an anthropologist observing an alien culture, trying to understand family dynamics that bore no resemblance to the cold efficiency of her own childhood. After Owen was put to bed, a process involving teeth brushing, pajamas, 3 stories, medication administration, and multiple assurances that Daddy would be right in the next room, Daniel returned to find Victoria washing dishes at the sink. She'd never washed a dish in her adult life, had staff for such mundane tasks, but something about being in this space made her want to contribute rather than simply consume. Daniel made coffee without asking if she wanted any, and they sat on the worn couch that had probably been second-hand when he bought it and was definitely third-hand now. The silence between them felt different than the professional quiet of conference rooms or the calculated pause of negotiation tactics. This was companionable, almost comfortable, the kind of quiet that happened when 2 people stopped performing and simply existed in the same space. Thank you for dinner. Victoria wrapped both hands around the coffee mug, absorbing warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. It was nothing special, just basic cooking that anyone can learn with practice and patience. It was. It really was. She paused, choosing words carefully. Owen seems resilient, recovering from what happened better than I would have at his age. Kids bounce back when they feel loved and secure, when they trust that the adults in their lives will protect them even when bad things happen. Daniel's voice carried no accusation, just statement of fact that somehow made Victoria feel worse than any criticism could have. He doesn't need more exposure to that corporate world, to people like Blackwood who mistake cruelty for strength and brutality for business acumen. I didn't know Blackwood would do that, didn't anticipate that he'd weaponize a child to score points in whatever game he thinks he's playing. No, Daniel's response came flat, emotionless. But you knew something like it was possible. You knew bringing us into that world carried risks, and you calculated that those risks were acceptable if they got you what you needed. Victoria had no defense against truth delivered without malice. She slid her black American Express card across the coffee table, the metal making a soft sound against the wood. For expenses, whatever Owen needs, better apartment, medical bills, therapy, a car so you don't have to take the subway, no strings attached, no expectations beyond you using it to make your life easier. Daniel slid the card back without hesitation, his expression unchanged. I signed a contract for a specific sum. That's what I'll take. Nothing more and nothing less. Why won't you accept help when it's offered freely without conditions? His smile was tired but kind, the expression of someone explaining basic truths to someone who'd never learned them. Because I don't want my son thinking love is something you purchase with credit cards and cash transfers. He's lost his mother. I won't let him lose his understanding of what actually matters. The things that can't be bought or sold or traded like commodities on an exchange. Victoria left with the card still in her purse and a weight in her chest that had nothing to do with the 4 flights of stairs she descended. The subway ride back to Manhattan felt longer than the physical distance between Brooklyn and her penthouse, measured in values and priorities rather than stops and transfers. She'd purchased many things in her 34 years. This was the first time she'd tried to buy something more valuable than what she was offering, and the rejection stung in ways she couldn't fully process. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Victoria arrived at her office to find Evelyn Sterling already occupying the chair behind the desk, sitting in the CEO's seat with the casual authority of someone who'd built the throne and wasn't particularly impressed that someone else now sat in it. "We need to talk about your arrangement with Mr. Cross." Evelyn didn't waste time on pleasantries or small talk, never had, probably never would. "About what you thought you were doing and what's actually happening." Victoria's blood ran cold despite the office heating system keeping temperature at a precise 72 degrees. "What arrangement? I don't know what you're implying." Evelyn held up her tablet, screen displaying a private investigator's report complete with surveillance photos, financial records tracing the $5 million contract, timeline inconsistencies that made the Caribbean elopement story fall apart under minimal scrutiny. The evidence was comprehensive, damning, impossible to explain away. "Did you really think I wouldn't investigate? That I'd simply accept your sudden marriage at face value without verifying the details?" Evelyn's laugh carried no humor, just the sharp edge of disappointment tempered by grim satisfaction at being proven right. "I built this company from nothing. I know when someone's lying to me, especially when that someone is my own daughter using tactics I taught her." Victoria sank into the guest chair, suddenly unable to maintain the pretense of authority. "Then why haven't you exposed me? Why let this continue if you knew from the beginning?" "Because I wanted to see what would happen. Whether you'd learn anything from the experience, whether you'd grow beyond the cold calculations I modeled for you throughout your childhood." Evelyn leaned forward, and for the first time, Victoria saw something in her mother's expression that might have been regret. "When I told you to build a family, I didn't mean contract for one like you were acquiring a subsidiary. I meant open yourself to vulnerability, to messiness, to the risk of being hurt by people you allow close enough to matter. The company needs the Thornton merger. You set that requirement knowing how precarious. The company needs a CEO who understands that human beings are not assets to be managed or resources to be optimized." Evelyn's interruption carried decades of hard-won wisdom, purchased at prices Victoria was only beginning to calculate. "Your father and I didn't build Sterling and Hayes just to make money. We built it to provide good jobs, to support families, to create value that extended beyond shareholder returns. Somewhere in your climb to the top, you forgot that lesson." Victoria found her voice, though it came out smaller than she'd intended. "So this was a test. The family requirement, the merger contingency, everything was designed to see if I'd take the shortcut. And you did exactly what I expected. Found the most efficient solution, executed it flawlessly, treated human relationships like any other business problem requiring strategic thinking." Evelyn stood, moving to the window overlooking the city they'd both spent their lives trying to conquer. But something unexpected happened along the way. Something neither of us planned for. "What are you talking about?" "I've seen how you look at him. More importantly, I've seen how you look at yourself when you're with them, like maybe you're someone worth being beyond the title in the corner office and the power you wield like a weapon." Victoria wanted to deny it, to dismiss her mother's observation as wishful thinking from a woman projecting her own regrets onto her daughter's life. But the words wouldn't come, caught somewhere between her brain and her mouth by the uncomfortable truth that Evelyn had seen what Victoria had been trying desperately not to acknowledge. "I'm not going to expose you." Evelyn turned from the window and her expression softened into something that might have been maternal concern if Victoria had learned to recognize such things. "Not yet. but you have until the annual shareholder meeting in 2 months. Either show me you've built something real, or I'll sign the company over to the board and you'll get your settlement check and the lifetime knowledge that you failed the only test that actually mattered. After her mother left, Victoria sat alone in her office, paralyzed by the implications of everything she'd just learned. Evelyn had known from the beginning, had watched Victoria contract for a husband the way she'd contract for consulting services, had observed the calculated efficiency of the whole arrangement, and had waited to see it if her daughter would stumble into something genuine despite her best efforts to remain emotionally detached. When had Daniel and Owen stopped being a transaction? When had Victoria started thinking about them during board meetings? Started checking her phone for texts that never came because they'd agreed to minimal contact? Started feeling hollow when she returned to her penthouse after events where Daniel played his role perfectly and then disappeared back to Brooklyn? When had she started falling for a man she'd hired to pretend to love her? 2 floors down, Richard Blackwood sat in his office reviewing the private investigator's findings with satisfaction that bordered on glee. The manila envelope contained everything needed to destroy Victoria Sterling. Phone records proving no contact before the contract signing, flight manifests demonstrating the Caribbean elopement never happened, video footage from the tower security cameras showing the actual first meeting where money and terms were explicitly discussed. The PI sat across from him, professional and detached, awaiting instructions on how to deploy the ammunition they'd gathered. This is enough to bring her down, get the board to remove her, open investigations that will occupy her legal team for years. Question is what you want to do with it and when you want to strike. Blackwood smiled, the expression of a man who'd waited patiently for his opportunity and now saw it approaching like a train he'd carefully scheduled. We wait for the perfect moment, when she's most confident, most secure, believing she's successfully navigated the merger and the family requirement. Then we release everything at once, overwhelm her capacity to respond, and I'll be positioned to step in as the steady hand the company needs. The pieces were in place, the trap was set. All that remained was timing, and Richard Blackwood had always excelled at patience when it served his larger ambitions. Victoria and Daniel began seeing each other more frequently, not because the contract required it, but because Victoria found herself seeking his company in ways that had nothing to do with merger optics or board perceptions. She told herself it was about monitoring the arrangement, ensuring everything remained on track, maintaining quality control over an expensive investment. The rationalizations grew thinner each time she deployed them. The pediatric cardiologist's office occupied the 14th floor of a medical building in Midtown, decorated with cheerful murals that couldn't quite hide the underlying anxiety that permeated spaces where children face serious health issues. Victoria had asked to attend Owen's appointment, surprising Daniel with the request, but not explaining why she needed to be present for something so personal and painful. Dr. Sarah Martinez reviewed Owen's latest echocardiogram results with the practiced calm of someone who delivered difficult news to desperate parents multiple times per week. Charts and images filled her computer screen, showing a heart that was trying so hard but couldn't quite keep up with the demands a growing body placed on it. Owen's condition is deteriorating faster than we had hoped. His ejection fraction has dropped to 28%, which means his heart is pumping less efficiently with each beat. Dr. Martinez highlighted areas on the scan where blood flow showed abnormal patterns. We need to schedule surgery within the next 3 months, or we risk permanent damage to his cardiac muscle that even surgery can't reverse. Owen sat on Daniel's lap, playing with a toy truck, oblivious to the adults discussing his mortality in clinical terms designed to soften blow without obscuring reality. His lips showed the telltale blue tinge more frequently now, appearing whenever he got excited or tired or stressed by normal 3-year-old activities that shouldn't push a heart to its limits. After the appointment, they stood in the medical building's lobby, Daniel holding Owen close, his fear barely contained beneath the calm exterior he maintained for his son's benefit. I can move money around, get him into surgery faster, find the best cardiac team in the country regardless of cost. Victoria started, but Daniel cut her off. The timing isn't about money. It's about finding the right surgeon, the right team, the right facility with the specific expertise Owen's case requires. I've consulted with 6 different cardiac centers. We're scheduled with the best, and they can't move any faster without compromising other children who need care just as desperately. Victoria saw his hands shaking despite his steady voice, saw the terror he'd been living with for 3 years crystallized into a 3-month deadline that felt simultaneously too soon and not soon enough. "You're terrified." She said it quietly, statement rather than question. "Every single day, every time I check on him at night and watch his chest rise and fall, every time his lips turn blue, every time he gets winded from climbing stairs, I'm terrified that I'll lose him the way I lost Emma, that Owen will be taken from me, and I'll be completely alone with only regrets and photographs and memories that fade a little more each year." Victoria took his hand without thinking about it, without calculating the gesture or weighing its implications. Just held on, offering the only comfort she knew how to give: her presence, her attention, her refusal to look away from his pain. 2 weeks later, Victoria was working late in her office, something she did most nights because going home to her empty penthouse felt worse than remaining surrounded by work that at least gave her purpose. A knock on her door surprised her. Security usually called before allowing anyone up after hours. Daniel stood in the hallway, Owen asleep in a stroller beside him, wrapped in a blanket that had clearly seen better days but smelled like home and safety. "What are you doing here?" Victoria stood, suddenly conscious of how she must look, hair pulled back messily, makeup faded, jacket discarded, the carefully constructed CEO image abandoned hours ago. "Owen fell asleep during our evening walk. Your building was nearby. I thought maybe you'd want company, or maybe I wanted company, and you were the person I thought of when the silence got too loud." She should send them home, should maintain boundaries that were already so blurred they barely existed anymore, should protect herself from whatever was happening here that felt increasingly dangerous to the walls she'd spent a lifetime constructing. Instead, she said, "Come in," watched Daniel wheel the stroller carefully into her office, and felt something in her chest unclench that had been tight for so long she'd stopped noticing the constriction. They talked for hours while Owen slept peacefully, his presence somehow making the conversation feel safer, like the child's innocence created a bubble where honesty couldn't be weaponized. Daniel told her about Emma, not the hospital death story everyone knew, but the living person she'd been. Her laugh that came from somewhere deep in her belly. Her terrible singing voice that she deployed anyway with complete lack of self-consciousness. Her absolute certainty that everything would work out fine, right up until it didn't. Victoria found herself talking about things she'd never said aloud. Her childhood in a house where affection was measured in inheritance clauses. Her first job at Sterling and Hayes, where she'd worked twice as hard as any man to earn half the respect. Her absolute terror that everything she'd built was constructed on foundations too shallow to support genuine human connection. Daniel asked what she'd wanted to be before Sterling and Hayes consumed her life completely, before duty and expectations and her mother's impossible standards shaped her into someone she barely recognized in mirrors. A teacher. The answer came out before Victoria could stop it. Literature specifically. I wanted to help kids find themselves in stories, discover that books could show them worlds beyond whatever circumstances they were born into. Why didn't you? No judgment in the question, just genuine curiosity about roads not taken. My mother needed me, the company needed me, and I was good at business, really good. So I convinced myself it was enough, that success could substitute for meaning, that power could replace connection, that being needed professionally was the same as being wanted personally. Was it enough? No. The word hung between them, honest and raw, stripping away pretenses Victoria had maintained so carefully for so many years. Daniel didn't offer platitudes or easy solutions. He just nodded, understanding etched in his expression, and somehow that acceptance meant more than any advice could have. On Sunday morning, Victoria showed up at Daniel's apartment with bagels and coffee, something she'd never done before. Something that had required research to determine what kind of bagels and how much coffee and whether showing up unannounced was acceptable or creepy. The Brooklyn Bagel Shop had looked at her designer coat and pearl earrings with amused tolerance, taking her order while probably wondering what someone like her was doing in a neighborhood like this. Owen answered the door with Daniel, and his face lit up with delight that Victoria felt somewhere in the region of her heart. "Victoria, you came!" He launched himself at her legs, hugging with the unself-conscious enthusiasm of a 3-year-old who'd decided she was safe now. who'd moved her from the category of stranger to the category of family without requiring proof or guarantees or contractual obligations. They ate bagels at the small kitchen table, and Daniel taught Victoria to make his allegedly famous pancakes that were actually terrible but somehow perfect because they were made with hands that cared rather than with technique that didn't. Owen helped by making an enormous mess with flour, getting it in his hair and on his face, and all over the kitchen floor, laughing with pure joy at the chaos they were creating together. All three of them ended up covered in batter, laughing harder than Victoria could remember laughing in years, possibly ever. This was what she'd been missing. Not perfection, but presence. Not control, but connection. Not transactions carefully executed, but relationships messily built through pancake disasters and flour fights and 3-year-olds who loved without conditions. The manila envelope appeared on Victoria's desk on a Tuesday morning in the 5th month of their arrangement. No return address, no note, just comprehensive documentation of every lie she'd told and every manipulation she'd executed in service of passing her mother's test. Phone records showing the truth of when they'd first met, surveillance footage from the tower lobby capturing contract negotiations, financial transfers that made the transaction explicit and undeniable. A typed message accompanied the evidence, unsigned but clear in its implications. Someone has been investigating. This will be released at the shareholder meeting in 3 weeks unless you resign beforehand. You have time to step down gracefully or be destroyed publicly. Choose. Victoria's hands shook as she spread the materials across her desk, seeing her carefully constructed deception laid bare in black and white documentation that would survive any attempt at denial or spin. The Thornton merger would collapse immediately. Her position as CEO would become untenable. Everything she'd worked for would unravel in a matter of days. She called Daniel, her voice raw with panic she couldn't quite suppress. "We need to talk. Now. Everything is falling apart, and I need you to understand what's happening before it becomes public." He arrived within an hour, having left Owen with Mrs. Chen, his expression wary but concerned. Victoria showed him the envelope contents, watched his face as he processed the implications. "This is everything. The merger, my position, the company itself, everything I've worked toward my entire adult life, everything my mother built and entrusted to me." She paced behind her desk, energy desperate and frantic. "We need damage control. A unified front. We convince them the evidence is manipulated, that someone with a vendetta is trying to destroy us through fabricated documentation." "No." The single word stopped her mid-stride. "What do you mean, no? This is survival, Daniel. This is everything. I won't lie anymore. Not to protect you, not to protect the company, not for any amount of money." His voice stayed level but carried steel underneath. "Not unless you tell me the truth first. The real truth you have been avoiding since the day we signed that contract." "What truth?" "You know everything, the contract, the terms, the timeline, the money, everything is documented in those papers you're looking at." "Not that truth." He stood facing her across the desk that suddenly felt like a barrier they'd been building together for months. "The truth about why this matters so much to you. The real reason behind everything, not the merger story or the board requirements. Why proving you can have a family matters more than anything else in your life, including your own happiness." Victoria felt walls she'd constructed over 34 years begin to crack under pressure she'd never anticipated. She could dismiss him now, terminate the contract, find another way forward as she always had. But something in Daniel's steady gaze held her in place, demanding honesty she wasn't sure she knew how to give anymore. The story came out in fragments, pieces of a mirror she'd shattered long ago and never reassembled. Evelyn Sterling had built the company from nothing through ruthless determination, starting as a secretary and clawing her way up through talent and work ethic and willingness to outwork anyone who underestimated her. But she'd also raised Victoria with zero warmth. No affection beyond relentless expectations of excellence. Constant reminders that anything less than perfect was failure. She told me at 16 that I'd inherit everything, but only if I proved I understood what she never did. That success without connection is just isolation with expensive furniture. That power without love is just loneliness with a corner office and a view that doesn't fill the emptiness inside. Victoria's voice went hollow, distant, pulling words from places she usually kept sealed. She wanted me to build a family, not just a company, prove I was more human than she managed to be, more capable of vulnerability than the woman who'd mastered everything except genuine relationships. Daniel listened without judgment, without interruption, giving her space to finally speak truths she'd been choking on for years. And if I fail? Victoria's laugh came out bitter. She gives everything to the board. The company gets restructured, sold piece by piece, and I get a settlement check in lifetime knowledge that I failed the only test she ever set that actually measured what kind of person I'd become, rather than what kind of executive I could be. So this marriage, me and Owen, we're all about passing your mother's test and securing your inheritance. Yes, the admission felt like confession, too long withheld. At first, that's all it was. You were a means to an end, a solution to an impossible problem. Another transaction like every other transaction that makes up my entire carefully calculated life. She met his eyes without the calculations that usually guided her, without the strategic thinking that colored every interaction. But then you refused to be diminished when I tried to make you small. You kept your dignity when I did everything possible to take it away. You showed up as completely yourself even when I made it clear that yourself wasn't good enough for the world I operate in. Her voice dropped to barely above whisper, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know how to handle someone I can't control or manipulate or manage like every other variable in my life. I don't know what to do with the fact that I've fallen in love with you, actually in love, when that was never part of the plan and completely ruins everything I was trying to accomplish. Silence filled the office like smoke after an explosion. Daniel stood perfectly still, processing information that rearranged everything he'd thought he understood about their arrangement and her motivations. I need time to think. He moved toward the door, each step deliberate, measured. About what you just said. About whether you mean it or whether this is another strategy designed to keep me complicit in your deception. Daniel, wait. No, you've had 5 months to figure out what this is. I'm taking a few days to decide whether I believe you're capable of the kind of honesty that love requires, or whether you're just scared of losing your company and willing to say anything to keep your acquisition intact. The door closed behind him. Victoria stood alone in her office, having spoken truth for the first time and longer than she could remember, with no idea whether that truth had saved anything or simply destroyed the last thing that mattered. Daniel walked Brooklyn streets for hours after leaving Victoria's tower, Owen safely with Mrs. Chen, his thoughts circling the same questions like water finding a drain. Did Victoria mean what she'd said? Was her confession genuine emotion or calculated strategy deployed when other options had failed? Could someone who'd spent their entire life treating relationships as transactions suddenly transform into someone capable of real love? Emma's voice came to him from memory, something she'd said when they were dating and he'd expressed doubts about commitment. Love isn't about certainty. It's about choosing someone despite uncertainty, deciding their worth exceeds the risk of being hurt. But Emma had never lied to him. She'd never contracted for his presence, never treated him as a problem requiring a $5 million solution. Victoria had done all of that and more, had shown him exactly who she was in those early weeks of casual cruelty. Yet he'd also seen her face when Owen cried, seen her reaction to his background report revealing everything she'd assumed wrong, seen her showing up with bagels and making terrible pancakes and laughing with flour in her expensive hair. Those moments couldn't be faked, couldn't be strategized, couldn't be anything except genuine human connection breaking through carefully maintained walls. The question wasn't whether Victoria could love. The question was whether Daniel could trust that love enough to risk his son's stability. Owen's carefully constructed sense of family on a woman who'd proven she was willing to lie for personal gain. He found himself on a bench in Prospect Park, watching families play in the fading afternoon light. Fathers pushed children on swings. Mothers spread picnic blankets. Couples walked hand in hand, building lives together through accumulated small moments rather than dramatic gestures. Could he have that with Victoria? Could she learn to value those small moments more than board meetings and merger negotiations? Could she put Owen's well-being ahead of company concerns when the two inevitably confided? The only way to find out was to strip away every transactional element, give up the money that made their relationship conditional, see if she wanted him when there was nothing left except two people trying to figure out if love could survive its soil that had been salted by deception from the start. Daniel pulled out his phone, sent a single text. I know what needs to happen. Tomorrow, shareholder meeting. Be ready. Then he went home to his son, the only certainty in a life that had just become infinitely more complicated, impossibly, more full of hope than he'd felt since Emma died, and took all his expectations of future happiness with her. The annual shareholder meeting convened in Sterling and Hayes' grand ballroom, a space designed to intimidate with soaring ceilings that rose 3 stories high, crystal chandeliers imported from Vienna, casting light that cost more per hour than most families spent on groceries in a month. 300 investors, board members, and executives filled rows of chairs upholstered in fabric woven specifically for this room, their combined net worth exceeding the GDP of small nations. Victoria stood backstage, arranging notes for the most critical presentation of her career. Every word had been crafted and refined through 17 drafts, every statistic verified by 3 separate teams, every projection stress-tested against worst-case scenarios that would make pessimists look optimistic. This speech would either cement her position or destroy everything she'd built, and the margin between those outcomes felt thinner than the paper she held. Daniel sat in the front row with Owen on his lap, the boy's small hands clutching a coloring book that Mrs. Chen had provided for the long event ahead. Owen looked tiny in his button-down shirt, his dress shoes that pinched his feet, his hair combed neatly instead of sticking up in the cowlicks Daniel usually let be, because fighting that battle seemed pointless. The boy's lips showed faint blue today, the subtle warning sign that his heart was working harder than it should, that time was running out faster than any of them wanted to acknowledge. Evelyn Sterling occupied a seat in the back row, positioned where she could observe without being observed, watching her daughter prepare to perform or fail in ways that would define everything that came after. Her expression revealed nothing. Decades of poker faces deployed in boardrooms teaching her to hide reactions that might give opponents leverage. Richard Blackwood sat 3 rows from the front, manila envelope resting on his lap like a loaded weapon waiting for the perfect moment to discharge. He'd timed this carefully, calculating that maximum damage required maximum confidence before the revelation, that Victoria needed to believe she'd succeeded before he showed her exactly how thoroughly she'd failed. Victoria took the podium, gripping its edges with hands that wanted to tremble but didn't, because CEOs didn't show weakness in front of 300 people who would interpret any hesitation as incompetence. She opened her mouth to begin the performance that might save everything she'd worked for, the words she'd memorized flowing toward her lips like water finding a channel. Daniel stood up. The movement rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water, heads turning to track him as he took Owen's hand and walked toward the stage. 300 pairs of eyes followed his progress, confusion spreading through the assembled executives like a virus nobody had vaccines to combat. This wasn't scripted. This wasn't planned. This was deviation from carefully orchestrated proceedings, and deviation made people who valued control deeply uncomfortable. Victoria's prepared remarks died unspoken, her carefully constructed narrative abandoned as Daniel reached the podium. Her face showed confusion warring with alarm, professional composure cracking under the strain of having no idea what came next. "What are you doing?" The words came out barely above a whisper, meant only for him, but the microphones caught in them anyway and broadcast her uncertainty to everyone present. "Saving you from yourself." Daniel's response carried the calm of someone who'd made a decision and found peace in its inevitability. "Saving both of us from the lies that have been eating us alive from the inside out." He turned to face the crowd, Owen standing beside him, small hand gripping his father's larger one with 3-year-old trust that adults would handle whatever came next. The boy looked solemn beyond his years, sensing the weight of this moment without understanding its specific contours, knowing only that something important was happening, and his daddy needed him close. "My name is Daniel Cross." His voice filled the ballroom without strain, carrying clearly to the back row where Evelyn sat forward slightly in her chair. "Some of you know me as Victoria Sterling's husband, the man she introduced as her partner 6 months ago, with stories about Caribbean beaches and mutual friends and love that bloomed quickly between two people meant to find each other. Silence crashed down like a wave breaking against rocks. Owen pressed closer to his father's leg, seeking shelter from attention that felt too bright, too focused, too overwhelming for someone whose heart couldn't handle stress the way other children's could. I'm here to tell you that every word of that story was a lie. Every detail manufactured, every emotion fabricated, every element designed to convince you and the Thornton family and her mother that Victoria Sterling had achieved something she hadn't, a genuine human connection built on foundations deeper than strategic planning. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, shock giving way to confusion, giving way to anger, as implications sank in like arrows finding at targets. Victoria stood frozen, her face draining of color beneath makeup applied with professional precision, hours ago when she'd still believed this day would go according to plan. Daniel continued, his voice steady despite the storm he was unleashing. I'm not a husband. I'm a carpenter who builds furniture in Brooklyn. Before that, I was a financial analyst at Hartwell and Partners for 6 years, on track to make partner before my wife got sick, and I chose to be present for her final months, instead of climbing a ladder that suddenly seemed less important than holding her hand while machines breathed for her. He paused, letting the confession breathe, giving people time to absorb information that rearranged their understanding of reality. Owen looked up at him with wide eyes, not understanding the words but recognizing the seriousness in his father's tone. Ms. Sterling offered me a contract, $5 million to play her devoted husband for 1 year, to appear at events like this and smile for cameras and convince skeptical people that she'd found the stability and family values her business partnerships required. I accepted because my son has 4 holes in his heart, because the surgery to fix them cost more than I could earn in a decade of honest work, because when you're a single father watching your child's lips turn blue from insufficient oxygen, you'll sign any contract that keeps him alive. The confession hung in the air like smoke from an explosion, toxic and impossible to ignore. Richard Blackwood sat rigid in his seat, his carefully planned revelations stolen by the man he'd been planning to destroy, his power play neutralized by someone willing to detonate everything rather than wait for controlled demolition. That's the truth. The whole truth without spin or explanation or justification. Daniel's jaw tightened, muscle working beneath skin as he forced out words that cost him something essential. We lied to you. We lied to the Thorntons. We constructed an elaborate fiction because Victoria needed a family to secure her inheritance and I needed money to save my son, and we calculated that our mutual desperation made the deception acceptable. He looked at Victoria, and something in his gaze made her breath catch despite the catastrophe unfolding around them. But here's what else is true, what I didn't expect when I signed those papers and took that money. If a company needs fabricated families to survive, its leadership has already lost sight of what actually matters. If the only way to close a deal is lying about who you are and what you value, then maybe that deal isn't worth closing in the first place. The words landed like hammer blows, each one driving home truths that made comfortable people uncomfortable, that forced them to examine foundations they'd never questioned because questioning might reveal cracks they'd rather ignore. I won't be part of that lie anymore. Not for $5 million, not for 50 million, not for any amount of money, because the one lesson I want to teach my son is that integrity isn't for sale, that character can't be purchased, that being an honest man matters more than being a comfortable one. Daniel reached into his jacket and withdrew the contract, all 47 pages folded and creased from months of existence, physical evidence of the transaction that had brought them to this moment. He held it high enough for everyone to see, making sure cameras captured what came next, ensuring no ambiguity about his intentions. I'm terminating our agreement, Miss Sterling, right here in front of 300 witnesses, so there can never be confusion about what happened today. So my son will understand that his father chose principle over profit when the choice presented itself. The sound of tearing paper cut through the silence like a gunshot. Daniel ripped the contract in half, then in half again, then again until it became pieces too small to reassemble, confetti representing the death of their arrangement. He let the fragments fall, watching them drift to the stage floor like snow that would never melt because the damage was permanent, irreversible, complete. I don't want my son growing up thinking his father could be bought. The words came quiet but devastating, each syllable precisely placed for maximum impact. Whatever happens next, whatever consequences follow from this confession, that's not the lesson I'm teaching him. That's not the man I'm choosing to be. He took Owen's hand, preparing to walk away from the stand and the company and the woman who'd hired him to pretend, to disappear back into Brooklyn obscurity where people lived lives of honest struggle rather than comfortable deception. Owen looked up at him with confusion and trust competing in his expression, certain that Daddy was making the right choice even if the reasons remained opaque. Wait, Victoria's voice cracked on the single syllable, breaking open something she'd kept sealed for 34 years. Daniel, wait, please. He stopped but didn't turn, every line of his body radiating the intention to leave, to extract himself and his son from this world that had proven toxic to everything he valued. Owen glanced back at Victoria with curious eyes, waiting to see what the pretty lady would do now that his daddy had said important things that made grown-ups gasp and whisper. Victoria stepped from behind the podium, abandoning her prepared remarks and her carefully constructed defenses and her professional armor. 300 people watched her cross the stage toward Daniel, toward the man who just destroyed her publicly because destroying her was kinder than continuing the lie, toward the father protecting his son's understanding of integrity at the cost of financial security. I don't need a contract. Her voice came out raw, scraped clean of the polish she usually maintained. I don't need a fake husband to convince anyone of anything. Don't need manufactured families to pass my mother's tests or close my merger deals. She stopped within arm's reach, close enough to see the exhaustion in Daniel's eyes, the fear beneath his bravery, the love for his son that eclipsed every other consideration. What I need is you, not the performance, not the pretense. You, the real person who makes terrible pancakes and refuses to let anyone diminish him and sees through every wall I've constructed to hide from genuine human connection. Daniel finally turned to face her fully, and the look that passed between them carried weight that cameras couldn't capture, nuance that observers couldn't fully decode. Why should I believe you mean that when everything between us has been built on lies I participated in? Because you're the first person who ever made me want to be more than what I was raised to be. Victoria's voice dropped, intimate despite the 300 people listening. The first person who made me think I could be something other than the cold, efficient machine my mother modeled, who showed me that strength can exist alongside vulnerability, and that power means nothing if you're too afraid to be genuinely known by anyone. Before anyone could respond, movement from the back of the room drew attention. Thomas Whitmore stood slowly, supporting himself with an elegant cane carved from wood that had probably cost more than Daniel's entire apartment, his presence commanding despite, or perhaps because of, his 71 years in the gravitas that came with building several fortunes through combinations of luck and skill. I'd like to say something before we proceed with any votes or motions or the parliamentary procedures that will undoubtedly follow this remarkable confession. His voice carried authority earned through decades of boardroom battles, of deals won and lost, of watching patterns repeat themselves with slight variations but essential similarities. Mr. Cross, you mentioned working at Hartwell and Partners. I believe you were involved in the Hartwell-Meridian merger approximately 4 years ago. Daniel nodded slowly, uncertain where this was heading, but recognizing that Thomas Whitmore didn't speak without purpose, didn't waste words on irrelevant tangents when outcomes hung in balance. Yes, sir, that was my last major project before my wife got sick and I took leave to be with her. That merger saved 14,000 jobs. Whitmore's statement landed with deliberate weight. Your strategy was brilliant, finding synergies others missed, creating value from assets both companies had written off, structuring the deal so both executive teams felt they'd won rather than creating the usual bloodbath where one side conquers and the other capitulates. I should know, I was on Meridian's board when you presented your proposal, and I've never forgotten the quality of that work. He paused, letting the implications settle over a crowd that was rapidly recalculating their understanding of the carpenter in the cheap suit. I'd like to hear what Mr. Cross thinks should be done about Sterling and Hayes' current situation. If he's honest enough to expose his own arrangement before 300 witnesses at enormous personal cost, perhaps he's honest enough to offer advice worth hearing about how this company should proceed. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge disguised as opportunity. Victoria's eyes widened slightly. This wasn't in anyone's script, wasn't predictable or controllable, represented exactly the kind of chaos that terrified people who'd spent their lives managing risk through careful planning. Daniel looked at Owen, then at Victoria, then at the crowd that had pivoted from judgment to curiosity in the space of 30 seconds. He'd come here to destroy the lies. He hadn't anticipated being asked to help build something true from the wreckage. You want advice from someone who just confessed to fraud? The question came out careful, testing boundaries, uncertain whether this was trap or genuine request. I want advice from someone who valued his son's moral education more than $5 million. Whitmore's response carried the firmness of someone who'd made his decision and wouldn't be swayed by objections. Someone who understands that all the strategic planning in the world means nothing if you've lost sight of why you're building things in the first place. Daniel set Owen down gently, making sure the boy was stable on his feet, then stepped forward to address the 300 people who'd come expecting routine corporate theater and instead gotten something uncomfortably real. His financial analyst training surged back like muscle memory, patterns clicking into place, seeing the company's vulnerabilities and opportunities with clarity that had made him valuable before grief and fatherhood had redirected his priorities. He spoke for 20 minutes without notes or hesitation, laying out a comprehensive vision for Sterling and Hayes that addressed every weakness the Thornton merger had been designed to patch. Sustainable growth instead of aggressive expansion that would overextend resources and leave the company vulnerable to market fluctuations. Employee retention as competitive advantage. Investing in people who understood the business rather than churning through bodies trying to find cheaper labor. Diversified revenue streams that didn't depend on any single partnership, spreading risk across multiple sectors so one failure couldn't cascade into catastrophe. He drew on his Hartwell experience but also on his carpentry, talking about building things meant to last rather than things designed to impress analysts for a single quarter. About foundations that could support future growth rather than facades that looked impressive but crumbled under pressure. About measuring success in decades rather than fiscal years. About creating value that extended beyond shareholder returns to include the communities where employees lived and worked. By the time he finished, more than half the room was nodding, despite themselves, recognizing wisdom in the carpenter's words that their expensive consultants had failed to articulate in thousands of pages of reports and presentations. Daniel Cross understood what mattered because he'd sacrificed everything for it, because he'd chosen meaning over money and discovered the freedom that came with knowing exactly what you valued and why. Richard Blackwood stood abruptly, his chair scraping against hardwood with a sound like nails on chalkboard. His face had gone red with rage poorly contained, veins visible in his temples, hands clenched into fists that wanted to strike something but couldn't because violence was beneath him and also illegal. This is absurd, completely absurd. His voice shook with a fury that made spittle gather at the corners of his mouth. The man just confessed to fraud, to accepting millions of dollars to deceive this board, to lie to our merger partners, to participate in elaborate deception that could expose us to lawsuits and regulatory investigations. And you want to take advice from him? You want to listen to his recommendations about how we should run this company? He turned on Victoria with venom that had been building for years, decades perhaps, since Evelyn Sterling had first outmaneuvered him and every subsequent slight had accumulated like interest compounding. I move for immediate restructuring of leadership. Ms. Sterling has proven herself unfit for her position through actions that violate not only our trust, but potentially securities laws. We need to remove her before Thomas Whitmore cut him off with the authority of someone who'd forgotten more about corporate maneuvering than Blackwood would ever learn. Interesting that you mention investigations, Richard, because I've been conducting one of my own over the past 2 months into who hired the private investigator gathering evidence about Ms. Sterling's marriage, into who authorized the use of company funds for surveillance that had nothing to do with legitimate business purposes. Blackwood's face shifted from red to pale so quickly it seemed medically concerning. I don't know what you're implying. I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts supported by documentation you'll find difficult to refute. Whitmore produced his own envelope, thicker than Blackwood's, more comprehensive in its damning details. Security footage showing you meeting with the investigator, financial records tracing payments from accounts you control, emails discussing strategy for releasing this information at maximum impact to facilitate your takeover attempt. The screens around the ballroom flickered to life, displaying images that made several board members gasp audibly. Blackwood in restaurants with the PI. Blackwood transferring money through shell corporations designed to hide the transactions. Blackwood's emails laying out his plan in language that revealed not just ambition, but contempt for the woman he was trying to destroy. You weren't trying to protect this company. Whitmore's voice carried disappointment that hurt worse than anger ever could. You were trying to steal it through manufactured scandal, using company resources for personal gain, violating fiduciary duties so flagrantly that I'll be recommending the board file charges for embezzlement in corporate espionage. Blackwood opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again like a fish drowning in air. No words came, no defense that could survive contact with evidence displayed on screens for everyone to witness. Security personnel moved toward him from the doors, prepared to escort him out if he didn't leave voluntarily, ready to handle the ugliness that sometimes followed exposure. He left without speaking, his expensive shoes clicking against floor that had witnessed better exits, his back rigid with fury that had nowhere left to go except inward, where it would fester into bitterness lasting years. The door closed behind him, and collective tension in the room released like pressure from a valve that had been stuck too long. Evelyn Sterling stood from her back row seat, and every head swiveled to watch her progress toward the stage. She moved with the deliberate grace of someone who'd learned to make entrances decades ago, who understood that timing and presence mattered as much as words when making statements that would be remembered and analyzed and discussed long after the immediate moment passed. She studied Daniel first, then Owen, who'd reclaimed his coloring book and was working on a picture of a house with careful 3-year-old concentration. Finally, her gaze settled on Victoria, and her expression softened into something that might have been maternal affection if you looked quickly and didn't examine too closely. When I set my test for you, requiring you to build a family before receiving your inheritance, I expected you to fail. Evelyn's admission came without apology or embarrassment, just statement of fact delivered by someone who'd stopped caring about appearing harsh years ago. I thought you'd do exactly what you did, contract for a husband the way you'd contract for consulting services, execute the arrangement with efficiency that prioritized outcomes over authenticity, check boxes without ever opening yourself to genuine vulnerability. Victoria's throat worked, but no sound emerged, caught somewhere between defense and acceptance of criticism she'd heard in various forms her entire life. But something happened I didn't anticipate, something neither of us planned for or controlled or managed according to our usual strategic frameworks. Evelyn's gaze moved to Daniel, then back to her daughter. You fell in love, actually genuinely fell in love. The messy, terrifying, inconvenient kind that refuses to follow scripts or respect boundaries or behave according to cost-benefit analyses. She turned to Daniel, acknowledging him directly for the first time. You gave up $5 million to protect your son's understanding of what integrity means, choosing his moral education over your own financial security. That's not nothing. That's everything, really, when you strip away all the noise and focus on what actually builds character worth having. Then back to Victoria, and something in Evelyn's expression cracked just slightly, revealing the mother beneath the CEO mask. And you just stood in front of 300 people and chose love over power, chose vulnerability over control, chose being honestly imperfect over maintaining the facade of having everything perfectly managed. The next words came softer, weighted with decades of regret about choices made and opportunities missed, and the person she'd failed to become while succeeding at everything else. That's what I was testing for, Victoria. Not your ability to fake a family, but your willingness to become someone capable of having a real one. Not your skill at checking boxes, but your courage to be genuinely known by another person despite all the risks that entails. Evelyn straightened, formal authority reasserting itself over momentary maternal warmth. The company is yours. Not because you executed a successful deception, but because you built something genuine from dishonest foundations. Because you proved capable of transformation I never managed in my own life. She walked off the stage without waiting for response, leaving Victoria and Daniel standing in the wreckage and possibility of everything they just destroyed and might be able to build from the pieces scattered around them. 2 weeks later, Daniel sat in the surgical waiting area at Children's Hospital of New York, watching numbers tick by on a clock that seemed to move both too fast and too slowly simultaneously. Owen's surgery had been scheduled for 8 hours, a complex procedure involving opening his chest, stopping his heart, putting him on bypass while surgeons repaired 4 separate defects that had been slowly killing him since birth. Victoria occupied the chair beside him, their hands intertwined in a grip that had started unconscious and become necessary. Neither of them certain when the other would let go or whether letting go was even possible anymore. She cleared her entire schedule for the day, something the old Victoria never would have done, something that would have been unthinkable 6 months ago when Owen was just a 3-year-old complication in her strategic planning. The pre-surgery moments haunted them both. Owen in his tiny hospital gown, clutching the stuffed elephant Daniel had carved from wood years ago, trying to be brave for the adults whose fear he could feel despite their attempts to hide it. "Daddy, I scared," his small voice barely above whisper, his blue lips more pronounced under fluorescent lighting designed to reveal every medical vulnerability. Daniel had knelt beside the gurney, gathering his son close, breathing in the scent of No More Tears shampoo and the antiseptic soap they'd used to scrub him clean of germs that might cause infections. "I know, buddy, but the doctors are going to fix your heart, make it strong like it should have been from the beginning. When you wake up, I'll be right there. I promise." Promise, promise? Owen's vocabulary for absolute commitments. The phrase reserved for things that mattered more than regular promises. "Promise, promise, I'm never leaving you. Not even when you're asleep and can't see me." Owen had looked past his father to where Victoria stood back, uncertain of her place in this intimate moment of fear and love. "Victoria come too?" She'd stepped forward, kneeling on the other side of the gurney, and took Owen's small hand in hers. "I'm here, sweetheart, if you want me to be. Stay, please." The little boy's face showed the simple certainty of someone who'd decided she belonged in his family, who'd moved her from the category of stranger to the category of person who stayed when things got scary. Families stay. The words had broken something in Victoria's chest, shattered defenses she'd maintained through decades of deliberate emotional isolation. "Of course I'm staying. I'm not going anywhere." Now, 4 hours into the surgery, they waited in chairs designed by people who'd never sat in them for extended periods, drinking coffee that tasted like despair, watching other families cycle through their own medical crises with the hollow awareness that suffering was universal and particular simultaneously. Dr. Martinez emerged at hour 5, still in surgical scrubs, her face graved beneath the operating room cap. There were complications, more damage than the scans showed, scar tissue from years of insufficient oxygen, heart muscle that had compensated so long it had changed structure in ways we didn't anticipate. Daniel felt the floor tilt beneath him, Victoria's hand tightening on his, becoming the only thing keeping him tethered to earth. "What does that mean? He's alive. We're still working, still repairing, but it's taking longer than planned, and the next few hours are critical." Dr. Martinez's professional calm contained empathy that felt worse than clinical detachment would have. "I wanted you to know what's happening rather than leaving you wondering why we've exceeded our estimated timeline." She disappeared back through doors that swung shut with mechanical precision, leaving them alone again with fear that had grown teeth and claws, that was actively chewing through whatever hope they'd been clinging to. Daniel made a sound that wasn't quite a sob, wasn't quite a prayer, just raw expression of terror that had been building for 3 years and was finally getting released because he couldn't contain it anymore. Victoria pulled him close, let him shake against her while she stayed solid, becoming the anchor he needed when his own foundations crumbled. She didn't offer platitudes about everything being okay or assurances she couldn't guarantee. She just held on, present in the pain, refusing to look away from the possibility that this could end in loss that would destroy the man she'd come to love, despite every logical reason not to. Hour 8 came and went. Hour 9. Victoria brought water. Daniel didn't drink. Food he couldn't taste. Her presence the only thing that mattered as minutes stretched like taffy being pulled. Each second distinct and endless. At hour 11, Dr. Martinez returned, and her expression made Daniel's heart stop before she spoke. He made it. The repair is complete, and while the next 24 hours remain critical, I'm cautiously optimistic about his prognosis. The relief hit like a physical blow, driving air from lungs that had forgotten how to work properly. Victoria made a sound somewhere between laugh and sob, her own terror releasing now that permission had been granted to feel something other than dread. Daniel couldn't speak, couldn't process words into coherent thoughts, could only nod and wait for his breathing to remember its rhythm. They were allowed into recovery 30 minutes later. Owen looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by equipment that clicked and beeped and hummed with the sound of life being monitored and sustained. Tubes and wires connected him to machines that were breathing and measuring and displaying numbers that meant everything to the medical staff and nothing to Daniel except that his son was alive. "Hey, buddy." Daniel's voice cracked on the words, his hand finding Owen's carefully, avoiding IV lines and monitor leads, just needing contact that proved this wasn't dream or nightmare, but actual reality where his child had survived. "You did so good, so brave. I'm so proud of you." Owen's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and heavy with anesthesia still working through his system. "Daddy, right here, right where I promised I'd be. Hurts. I know, but you're going to be okay now. Your heart is fixed, all better, strong enough to let you run and play and do everything kids should be able to do." Owen's gaze drifted past his father, finding Victoria standing beside the bed, with tears streaming down her face that she made no attempt to hide or control. "You stayed." "Of course I stayed." Her voice came out waterlogged with emotions she'd spent 34 years learning to suppress. "I told you I would." Owen managed a small smile despite the pain medication and the trauma his body had just endured. "Family stays." Both adults broke simultaneously, the words hitting harder than any declaration of love or any romantic gesture could have. This simple truth from a 3-year-old who understood things they'd needed decades to figure out. Victoria reached for Owen's other hand, gentle around the IV, and together they flanked him. Two people who'd started as strangers, become accomplices in deception, transformed into something neither had believed possible. 6 months after the surgery, Owen ran through Prospect Park with energy that would have been impossible before his repair, chasing pigeons with single-minded determination that made other parents smile at his enthusiasm. His color was perfect now, his lips the pink they should have been from birth. His capacity for joy no longer limited by a heart that couldn't keep up with his spirit. Daniel watched from a bench, Victoria tucked against his side in a configuration that had become natural through repetition, through choosing each other day after day until the choice became habit, became identity. They'd moved into her penthouse but kept the Brooklyn apartment, splitting time between worlds that had seemed incompatible, but somehow worked when love became the bridge between them. Owen had started preschool, making friends with the unself-conscious ease of children who hadn't learned yet to guard themselves against potential rejection. He talked about his classmates constantly. Emma, who shared her crackers, Marcus, who could already write his whole name, Sophia, who knew all the dinosaur names and taught him how to pronounce the hard ones. Victoria had transformed Sterling and Hayes according to Daniel's restructuring recommendations, shifting focus from aggressive expansion to sustainable growth, from profit maximization to stakeholder value that included employees and communities alongside shareholders. The Thornton merger had been quietly abandoned in favor of organic development that didn't require compromising principles for partnership opportunities. Stock price had dipped initially, then climbed higher than before, as markets recognized that long-term strategy often outperforms short-term tactics. Daniel consulted for the company now, leading a new community investment division that built affordable housing and job training programs and childcare centers in neighborhoods that reminded him of Brooklyn before gentrification priced out families who'd lived there for generations. The work paid well enough to be comfortable, poorly enough to keep him grounded, fulfilling enough to make him glad he'd left carpentry without regretting the skills he'd learned from working with his hands. Sunday mornings had become sacred ritual, pancakes that remained terrible despite 6 months of practice, flour fights that left them all covered in white dust, Owen's laughter filling the kitchen with sound that made expensive penthouses feel like homes. Victoria had learned to be present, to silence her phone during dinner, to prioritize being overdoing in ways that still felt foreign, but increasingly necessary. On the bench in Prospect Park, watching their son chase birds that would never let him catch them, Daniel turned to Victoria with a question he'd been carrying for weeks. Do you ever regret it? The contract, the lies, everything we did to get here? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, not rushing to easy answers that would sound good, but might not be true. I regret hurting you and Owen with my initial cruelty. I regret the deception we perpetrated on good people who deserve better. I regret that we started with such a fundamentally dishonest foundation. But I don't regret where it led us. Don't regret learning that I could be someone capable of this. She gestured at Owen, at the park, at the life they'd built from wreckage. I think maybe I needed to hit bottom before I could figure out how to climb towards something real. Daniel pulled her closer, and they sat in comfortable silence, watching Owen's joy, understanding without words that some things took circuitous routes, that arriving at the right destination sometimes required getting lost first. That love didn't always announce itself with orchestras and fireworks, but sometimes crept up through pancake disasters, in hospital waiting rooms, and small boys declaring that families stayed. The ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Sterling and Hayes Community Center took place on a crisp October afternoon, 1 year after the shareholder meeting that had changed everything. The building stood in Brooklyn, designed with input from actual residents rather than architects who'd never lived in neighborhoods where people struggled paycheck to paycheck. It housed job training programs, affordable childcare, after-school tutoring, a medical clinic offering sliding scale fees, and a dozen other services that acknowledged that people needed support beyond what markets provided. Victoria stood at the podium delivering a speech she'd written herself without PR consultants or communications directors sanitizing her words into corporate blandness. She talked about second chances and genuine connection and building companies that serve communities rather than extracting value from them. She talked about learning that success measured in human flourishing mattered more than success measured in stock price, though ideally you could have both if you structured things thoughtfully. Daniel held the oversized scissors, Owen bouncing beside him with barely contained excitement about cutting the red ribbon that had been installed specifically for this moment. When Victoria finished speaking, father and son cut together, the ribbon falling away to applause from neighbors who'd attended because this mattered to them personally, because this center would serve their families and their friends and their struggles. Afterward, Victoria sat on the center's front steps to adjust her shoe. These particular heels had been rubbing her ankle raw for 3 hours, but she'd powered through the discomfort because admitting weakness still felt difficult despite 6 months of deliberate practice at vulnerability. Daniel appeared without being summoned, kneeling on concrete with complete disregard for his expensive suit, unlacing her shoe with gentle hands that understood care as instinct rather than performance. He examined the problem with the same attention he brought to everything that mattered, then retied the laces more loosely to relieve pressure without leaving her shoe so loose it would fall off. Such a small thing, such an ordinary act of noticing someone else's discomfort and responding without being asked. But Victoria felt tears prick her eyes because nobody had ever paid attention to her pain before. Nobody had ever offered care that expected nothing in return. Owen barreled over, inserting himself between them with the confidence of a child who knew his place in their family was secure and unquestionable. He grabbed one of Daniel's hands and one of Victoria's, swinging between them like a bridge connecting what had once seemed like separate worlds existing on incompatible frequencies. Now it's real, right? His voice carried the seriousness that came when 3-year-olds asked questions they've been thinking about for a while. Now we're actually a real family, not just pretending for the cameras or the business people. Daniel and Victoria exchanged looks over his head, communicating in the shorthand that developed when the two people learned each other deeply enough that words became optional. They had everything they'd never known they needed: dinners around tables, pancakes on Sunday mornings, flower fights that left kitchens destroyed, School pickups, where Owen told them about his day in enthusiastic run-on sentences that violated every grammar rule. Bedtime stories read in voices that changed for each character. Small hands that grabbed theirs when crossing streets. They had the slow, patient, difficult, rewarding work of learning to love and be loved without conditions or contracts or guarantees beyond choosing each other every day and trusting that the choice would continue mattering tomorrow. Yes, Victoria said, meaning it with every part of herself she'd spent a lifetime hiding from the world. Now it's real. Owen squeezed both their hands, satisfied with the answer in the way children were when adults told them important truths without hedging or qualifying or leaving escape roads for later revision. They walked toward the ice cream shop 2 blocks away, leaving the community center behind them, solid and welcoming, a physical manifestation of what happened when people chose meaning over money, connection over control, vulnerability over the safety of emotional isolation. Victoria's phone buzzed in her purse. She ignored it initially, but Daniel encouraged her to check. Old habits of constant availability dying hard despite genuine efforts at achieving better balance. The text came from Evelyn, characteristically brief and cryptic. Watch from the back again. You passed. With flying colors this time. We should talk when you're ready. Love, Mom. Victoria showed Daniel the message, and they shared a smile that acknowledged how far they'd traveled from the cold conference room where she'd purchased a husband and he'd accepted payment because desperation made them both willing to compromise, principles they'd later choose to reclaim. Evelyn had been orchestrating circumstances from the beginning, manipulating variables like a chess master moving pieces, creating situations where her daughter had to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Think she planned this whole thing? Daniel's question carried amusement rather than accusation. Probably. She's good at long-term strategy, at creating conditions where people reveal who they really are under pressure. Victoria tucked her phone away, more interested in ice cream with her family than parsing her mother's motivations. But it doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what we built from the mess she set in motion. At the ice cream shop, Owen chose chocolate with rainbow sprinkles and immediately got it all over his face, his shirt, his hands, and somehow the table despite Daniel's best efforts at containment. Victoria laughed, actually laughed, the sound surprising her with its unfamiliarity, realizing she couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed before meeting Daniel and Owen and learning that joy came from chaos rather than control. They walked home as the sun set over Brooklyn, painting the sky in colors that didn't care about quarterly earnings or board meetings or any of the things Victoria had once believed defined her worth. Owen held their hands, swinging between them, secure in the knowledge that he had both parents now, one by birth, one by choice, both committed to staying even when things got hard. Behind them, the community center stood as testament to transformation, to second chances, to the possibility of building genuine value from dishonest beginnings. Ahead of them, the future stretched out like an open door, full of uncertainty and possibility, and all the small, precious moments that accumulated into lives worth living. And for the first time in her 35 years, Victoria Sterling, now Victoria Cross, though the paperwork was still processing, wasn't afraid to walk through that door into whatever came next, because she wasn't walking alone anymore.